Well, there are some exciting things going on with these tanks and the other tanks here in the house, and I can't wait to go into detail. First, we're going to go out to the experiment station, and we're going to pick out a few fish to go into the Neon Tetra Blackwater tank. While we're out there, I'm going to show you some of the things I have going on in those tanks, and then we'll come back inside. Well, here we are in the experiment station, also known as the greenhouse, and I made some changes out here. I used to have two stock tanks, one here as well, and I decided to take it down and just use this space to store plants, especially now that it's winter. The stock tank just wasn't doing as well as this first one, and it wasn't very efficient for the amount of space it was taking up, so I thought I would consolidate all those plants into the 55 gallon, which worked out pretty well. And so I moved all the white cloud minnows in here as well. We'll take a look at those in a few minutes. And I've been running the heater. This is my heater set up. While the heater's running, I unplug all the air pumps and the filter that run to the stock tank and to the 55 gallon tank. So it's been a while since I've tested the water in this stock tank. So we're going to do that real quick. So I'm just using some Tetra Easy strips, and going to dip it real quick. We'll leave it right here. While that's getting ready to read, I'm going to go ahead and test the 55 gallon tank water as well. And we'll just leave it right there. Come back to that in just a minute. So it usually takes about a minute for that to get to a point where you can read it. But this tank, man, it's just doing awesome. I'm loving all the plant growth. Things have changed a little bit. There were some plants that I took out and actually moved to the 55 gallon, and they just made more sense to grow them there. So I've been trying to keep the larger plants here, and it seems to be working out pretty well. All these peace lilies came from inside. Some of them were, let's say 2 of them came from the Neon Tetra Blackwater tank, the 10 gallon setup. There's 2 more back there. And then the third came from the former 29 gallon setup before I upgraded the Neon Tetras to the 29 gallon. So anyway, I was just thinking the other day about this Syngonium, because I'm growing some of it inside, but that group of plants is over 2 years old now. And it just hit me the other day, like, wow, it's really doing great for being 2 years old. So a cool thing that I noticed the other day, the orchid is blooming, the ground orchid. Also have a moth orchid, which is Phalaenopsis is the genus, but the ground orchid is Spathoglottis. Monstera, I don't know if you've noticed, but this new leaf is a good bit smaller than the older leaves, which is interesting because all of last calendar year, this Monstera is just going gangbusters. I mean, putting out these huge leaves, and you can see how thick the stalk is, the stem. And it's almost as big around as my wrist, seems like. But all of a sudden, toward the end of last summer, I noticed it slowing down. And of course, it didn't do much through the winter. But then this spring, it still wasn't doing a whole lot. In fact, this is the only leaf that it has put on the entire year of 2022. And so what I'm thinking has happened is that it and the other plants have pretty much depleted the dirt substrate in this stock tank. At about an inch of topsoil, potting soil in the very bottom, and I capped it with about 3 inches of sand, and I've been just letting all these plant roots grow down and tapping into that substrate like I talk about in other videos. And that's, I think, one reason why they've all been doing so well. But the question always comes up, how long will it last? And especially with a plant that feeds so heavily like Monstera. And so I think I've kind of answered that question, at least for this individual tank. So that's just an interesting observation. But the Canna lily back here has been doing good. This was actually planted in early 2021, I believe, and it was an experimental plant. It was an experimental planter because I planted it in a cup with about an inch or so of dirt in the bottom, and then just capped it with sand, just like I did in the tank substrate here. Well, the canna grew just perfectly fine in that container, but then it sent roots down out of the top of the container, went down into the bottom of the tank, which is fine. But anyway, it's just interesting to see how this plant has been performing in that experimental container. So the pothos has been growing vines all over the place. It has grown across, down through under the water, and come up on the other side. And over here in the corner, let's see if we can get a good shot. You got some of the vines growing down on the ground, and they're loving it. The leaves are huge. Hopefully they'll make it through the winter. So many of these plants that I have just in the hanging baskets and down on the ground, a lot of these are riparian plants that I use, but I'm keeping my primary stock planted up as regular house plants, and that way I always have a bank of cuttings and divisions that I can draw on when I take on and build new projects, but also if I want to experiment more in different ways with these plants, I have the resources to do that. It's taken some time to build up this collection to the point that it's gotten, but it's definitely worthwhile for me, especially doing all these projects and all these experiments. So the way I'm trying to insulate the 55 gallon is with this neoprene anti-fatigue mat, which comes from Harbor Freight, and we'll take it off here. Though, yeah, one of the downsides to these larger stock tanks is you can't really see what's going on in there. It's more of a pond setting, and which is fine for a lot of fish, but with smaller ones, you want to see what's going on. So I couldn't see what was happening with the white clouds, but now I can. Now, anytime I want to check on them, I can just take down the insulation and try to get a closer look at them. I'm not sure if the glare is going to let me, but you see a few of them in there, and the numbers diminished. Unfortunately, they were in this former stock tank that was over here. The numbers were beginning to grow. They were breeding and multiplying. But then when I went to move them into this tank, I think I may have just gotten 6 or 7 out of there, and I started out with 10, and then they were multiplying. Oh, we need to check the test strips, don't we? The primary things I pay attention to are the nitrites, of course, and the pH and alkalinity. Now, the pH in these tanks is going to be off the charts because I'm using tap water. Okay, so the water test for the stock tank is pretty good. Low nitrates, no nitrites, but still high pH, as you can see down at the bottom. So that's just the way it goes with alkaline tap water. So these tanks are growing in a few different planters up top. They're all a variation of the basket planter. This spider plant is actually over a year old now. It's one of the experiments I started last year, and what I was experimenting with primarily was growing it in a substrate. So the substrate is a mixture of some aquarium substrate with some Eco-Complete and lava rock, maybe some gravel in there. I can't quite remember everything, but anyway, it's lined with fiberglass window screen. Now I did that just to see, again, it's just an experiment, just trying to see how things go. But there are some roots that are still growing out of the screen and beginning to grow down. So that was it's interesting to see how it's doing. Still got some money tree out here, and there's one more on the other side. Now these, I started them in the stock tank that was right across from us previously, and when I pulled them out, man, the roots were all the way down to the substrate already. So that was very encouraging. I think it's going to be a good long-term plant, and if I can get it into a place where I'm not moving it around very much and constantly disturbing it, then I think we'll see how it performs over the years. So these peace lilies are actually some of the larger varieties, kind of the giant peace lilies, but these were some leftover from what I was doing inside, and they were much larger than this. Unfortunately, as I was trying to adapt the large peace lilies, they were not doing so well, and they eventually died, but then new growth came back from the rootstock. So I've just left these out here, see how they do over time, and we'll see how that works out. There's some leftover lucky bamboo that I have. Man, I've got tons of this lucky bamboo, and I still, this is leftover from the cherry barb tank build, and I just couldn't fit all of it in there. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that yet, but we'll figure something out. This philodendron, I think it's a Congo Rojo philodendron. Now it stays pretty small. This normally gets much larger, when it's grown as a normal house plant, but it has been consistent. It has deepened in red since I planted it last year, and the way that I've been growing it is in a planter with a combination of lava rock, leca, I believe, and some sphagnum moss, and I'm keeping it slightly elevated so the lower half of the planter is underwater but the top half is above. And so that way it's we're treating the plant more like an epiphyte, but the roots can still access the water, but they don't have to be completely submerged. So another of last year's experiment that I'm really pleased with, and I'd like to try it out indoors at some point. So many plants and so many projects that I want to do, and so little space. I really need to get me a studio going somehow. Up here I've got I've got jungle boogie philodendron, which I'm not planning to grow in a riparium because it just gets so huge, but it's just a plant that I really like. And I am growing some pennywort, Brazilian pennywort, in this pot with it because I'm trying to see how it works as a terrestrial plant. Plus I need some stock of it because I'd like to grow it more in more of my tanks, but it doesn't do well for me submerged. But if I can grow it as a riparian style plant, I think it would do well. So yeah, I've still got so many experiments to do. This ficus in the back, I bought it last year with the intent of getting it going in a tank, but I haven't done that yet, and just got so much to do. And then I want to grow some more of this variegated ginger. I had some of it growing indoors. I don't know if you remember from a previous video, but when I moved it out here, it ended up dying, and so this is the parent plant that it came from. Well, then the parent plant had a difficult winter and barely survived, and so I had left it outside and it didn't fare so well. So now it's been growing out this whole year, so now I'll have some stock for next spring. I'm going to put some food out there for the guppies, lure them to the top, and that way we can then scoop some of them out and try to figure out which ones we want for indoors. Wow, look at those guys. The other day when I scooped some out, I got a number of different generations. Really the color that I'm looking for, kind of hard to see, but the color that I'm looking for is one of these that's mostly red with the red tail, kind of blonde body. That is actually the color pattern that inspired the logo, Plant Life Project logo. So I'm wanting to bring that back inside. But some of these have more purple in them. So these are just mutt guppies. I've had a number of different varieties in this tank over the past few years, and so it's not the most consistent strain, but that's what I love about colony breeding guppies is you never know what you're going to get, and it's always a surprise, and it's pretty cool. So I was thinking about getting a red male and a couple of females to go with him. And while we're out here, we'll check the water temperature, because I wanted to prove a point to you. Okay, so the water is just at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly above. So yeah, so these tanks get down into the 50s at their coldest point in the winter time in this heated greenhouse. And I don't put any heaters in here, that's how cold it gets. So the point that I'm trying to make is a guppy, which is a tropical freshwater fish, over time and through, I guess, multiple generations, can adapt to a colder water. Now, of course, they're not thriving to the same extent in this cold water as they would in the warmer. So in the summertime, they're doing great out here. They're multiplying prolifically, but they can survive in the colder water. And that's one of the things I really wanted to test when I brought them out here, was to see if through the generations I could develop some guppies that were more cold tolerant. Well, let's go back inside now and start acclimating these guppies. So before I put these guppies in the tank, I need to condition them to the new pH levels. The tank that they came from out in the greenhouse, as you remember, has a high pH of upper 7s, closer to 8. And this tank has a pH in the mid 6s, closer to 7, which is a pretty big swing in the pH. So we're trying to condition these guppies to prevent any shock. So I'm just taking out some of the stock tank water that the guppies came from, and over the next several hours I'm going to be slowly adding this tank water to the container the guppies are in now. And so that way it will slowly condition them to the new pH and hopefully prevent any type of shock. And it also gives them a chance to adapt to the warmer water temperature. And it also gives me a chance to more closely inspect the guppies' health to make sure I'm not adding any sick guppies into this tank. But they all look pretty good. I think they're going to be fine, but it's always good to double check that. And so having them acclimating over the course of hours gives me a chance to do that. So while we were acclimating these fish, let's see if we can take a look at inside the tank, and I'll show you some of the cool stuff going on. Move this out of the way. Hopefully we can cut down on the glare. That's why I have this black sheet down in front of these tanks, is to cut down on the glare, especially when I'm trying to shoot a video. So this tank's only a few months old, and it looks like it's been here for years. I mean, it's just incredible. It was definitely a good move. I'm so glad that I upgraded the neons to this setup. So this light that I keep on top is just usually temporary. I don't leave it on. It's just I turn it on for video purposes, so you can actually see inside the tank. Otherwise, there's no light getting down in the tank except for the riparium lights above. But man, these neons are just really having a blast in here. They're not nearly as skittish as they were over in the 10-gallon tank, and they just seem a lot more comfortable and confident, and they don't scare easily, and they're just always hanging out in the front here. And so yeah, for their sake, I'm glad I did this, because I'm glad that they're feeling more comfortable. This is probably closer to their natural habitat anyway, even though that 10-gallon wasn't too far off. It was just too small. So what I love about this tank most, I think, is the root growth. I mean, I'm just a big fan of the natural style tanks, in case you haven't noticed, but to have the roots as kind of the main feature in there. It's not really aquascaped. We're just trying to keep it natural, keep it as close to nature as possible. And so having all those roots coming down, I just love it. I just love that being the centerpiece and the focal point. So the issue with that is, at some point, I'm probably going to have to trim some of the roots. And I'm okay with that, but I think the way I'm going to do it, I'm not going to trim anything like horizontally. I'm only going to trim vertically. For example, this root coming off here that's growing down, I could trim it up here, and it's going to eventually put off new root growth. But the point is, I'm not going to trim all the roots that are tapped into the substrate, because then you're going to have suffering plants because they're accessing all these nutrients, and then you cut that supply off and they're going to stress really badly, and they may not be able to recover quick enough to get roots back down in the substrate. So the approach I'm going to take is just trying to shave off from front to back, if that makes sense, so that we still have a lot of the main roots going down in the substrate, but we can also clear out some space. Some other fish I want to put in here, and hopefully I can do that pretty soon. I want to put some albino cories in here. I really love cories, and I think the albino cories will show up better in this dark setting. You know, I'm adding these guppies as kind of a topwater species because they mostly hang out on the top, feeding off the surface and close to it. Oh, now these guys are getting skittish. They're like, oh, what's going on? Man, something scared them. But anyway, so all these leaves have started decomposing slowly, and I've actually added more. You can see the smaller ones that are caught in the roots, and there's still actually some floating. The magnolia leaves, the larger ones that I put in when I first built this, I'm surprised how quickly they are decomposing. Kind of see they're breaking down pretty quickly, and they're a very thick leaf, so it usually takes longer for them to break down, but I can only imagine just the amount of bacterial activity going on, and of course all the snails, all the decaying matter that the snails are feeding on, including the leaves, so they're breaking down pretty quickly. But these smaller ones I've added, and they're just leaves from my backyard. It's surprising though, as much leaf litter is what's in here, and the sticks, I've put so much rooibos tea in here, the water is not dark. Like, I'm really surprised that we haven't had more of a buildup of tannins. So it makes me wonder, is there something neutralizing the tannins in the substrate? And if you remember, this is an undergravel filter, a plenum style, and so it's about a 1-inch plenum at the very bottom, and then layers of substrates, gravel, aqua soil, or flue ball stratum, and some other things, fluorite. But I'm wondering if some of that is actually neutralizing the tannins as the water is slowly filtering through. I don't know that. It's just a suspicion that I have, but it's just curious that the water should be much darker than this, and it's really very clear. So that is a mystery for sure. I'll eventually figure it out. So the riparian plants have just gone gangbusters up here. I mean, this is just awesome. I'm so pleased with this. It looks like it's been here for years. It's only been a few months. The pothos has put out new growth. I don't know if you remember how hard I pruned this pothos. I pruned at least half of it off when it was set up in the earlier setup of this 29, and I just reused the pothos that was in there. And so, but yeah, it's doing great. It's starting to climb up on either end of the branch, and that's my goal, is to train it along that branch. The philodendron, golden goddess philodendron, has grown so much faster than I thought it would. And I've got 2 cuttings, one there and then one over here, and for some reason this one's taking off faster. This one is growing though, it's just a little more slowly, but I may have to trim that before too much longer, because it's about to get up to the light. The money tree I'm really pleased with how it's doing. It has roots. You can't really tell which one's which, but I have studied this, and I can trace some of the roots back to the trunk of the money tree. So those roots are steadily making their way down, and I'm anxious to see how fast it grows once it goes into the substrate, because like the ones in the greenhouse, once they hit the substrate in the stock tank, I could see a huge difference in their growth. So some other cuttings that I threw in here are Maranta prayer plant, and it has begun to root. I'm not sure how long it's going to last. It's usually pretty short-lived, but I'm hoping I can get some growth out of it. Of course, I've got the Syngonium, and it's not growing quickly, but it is putting on new growth, and it has sent off a ton of roots. So I can tell that. And some purple waffle plant. I'm not sure if it's getting enough light. Yeah, I may have too many things going on here at one time. Parlor palm is sending out some new leaves. So all that's encouraging. Even though this may be a bit crowded, I may need to change a few things. It's good to see all these plants are trying to grow, and some are dominating and some are not. But that's kind of the natural order, isn't it? But now we can see that the neons are nowhere to be seen. But the good news is they have a lot of places to hide. So when they do feel threatened, they can go hide, and they didn't have that luxury when they were in the 10-gallon over here. So I really think that was a good move on my part. And of course, it definitely helped to have blacked out both sides of the aquarium. Now there's some downsides to that, but in this area, in this location, it makes sense because you're not going to be able to see from the sides anyway. But all things considered, I'm really pleased with how this setup is growing, and I'm anxious to get some more fish in here, like the albino cories, get these guppies acclimated, and we'll see how it goes. I did collect some botanicals yesterday and wanted to show them to you. Got some elm bark, the common type of bark that I use in my tanks if I want tannins. Got a magnolia seed pod, and got some acorn caps in there too. I'll have to show them to you later. But anyway, I just let them soak in here to see how quickly I could get tannins released, and we can see it just took about 30 hours or so. So I'm going to go ahead and put a few pieces in here. Now, of course, they're not going to sink right away. They're probably going to float for another few days or longer, but that's okay. While they're hanging out up there, they'll be releasing tannins, and hopefully we can get this water a little bit darker. I thought about this last night. The problem that I mentioned with not having the tannins building up like I thought, it could be the kitty litter in the substrate. I wonder if that is what's neutralizing the tannins. And of course the water is being filtered through, and as it is, it could be acting kind of like carbon in the fact that it's neutralizing tannins. Don't know that for a fact though. Okay, so now we're going to put in the magnolia seed pod, and again it's probably going to float around, but as they sink, I want them to kind of collect in the front, because in addition to being useful for tannins and the bacterial component, it's also very interesting visually. It adds a new texture into the environment, just like it's interesting to see these leaves down there. I think having the seed pods, having the bark visible, especially as they change over time, as they decompose, that adds just a new level of interest to a tank like this. Well, now let's go over to the Nano Riparium jar. Now, I haven't done any maintenance on any of these tanks in at least 2 weeks, and so things aren't picture perfect, but that's life, isn't it? So the Betta's doing really well. He's just chilling out. His colors have been pretty vibrant since I put him in this setup. Seems more vibrant than usual. That could be just the tint of the water, or it could be the fact that we have tannins in the water now. I do a water change about every 2 weeks or so, so I'm due for one now. The main reason has been just to try to keep the tannins under control, because I do have that driftwood in there, and it has been leaching a lot of tannins. If you recall in the update video, I mentioned that I was battling with cyanobacteria, and it kept forming down here on the gravel. And so I was treating it with peroxide at first, because sometimes you can get it under control that way. Eventually tried the Ultralife blue-green slime remover, and it actually worked. I wasn't sure if it would, but It was my first time using it, obviously. But the thing I like about the Ultralife is that it doesn't require you to do any water changes afterward. It doesn't harm the biological filter, according to the label anyway, and I haven't seen any negative effects of using it. But the riparian plants have really surprised me. I mean, they really have. And the most surprising thing was that the Monstera has not done as well as I thought. So you can see it's starting to lose some of these leaves. They're turning yellow. So it was growing really strong for a while, but then as these other plants gained a foothold, the Monstera slowly began to struggle, and it kept sending out a vine, but we're not getting any leaves forming on that vine. And that's usually an indication of insufficient light. But there's a lot of light going on here. This is a grow light bulb in the lamp here, and then there's another grow light bulb on this side, but then these other two are just regular household LEDs. But there should be sufficient light for it. And so I don't know what's going on other than competition for nutrients. There's a whole lot going on in this tank, and the Monstera is obviously not doing as well. But the spider plant has really surprised me. I haven't always been successful with it, but what makes it successful here, I believe, is the fact that it has a shallow container that it's growing in, and so the roots can get down to the substrate and tap into those nutrients. And you can see just the root mass there is incredible. And in some angles, you can see it growing underneath the driftwood. So I really am excited about that. I'm anxious to see how long it will last in here. It's not showing any signs of slowing down, that's for sure. And I'm hoping I can get a flower stem coming out with more plantlets forming eventually. I think that would look amazing. But another big surprise was this inch plant, or wandering Jew. If you remember, I put 3 little cuttings in here, and you know, I knew they were going to grow. But again, it has been traditionally a short-lived plant for me, and it hasn't done nearly this well. But again, like the spider plant, in previous setups, I wasn't letting the roots grow down to the substrate, and so that's what I'm always talking about. And so sometimes I don't follow my own advice like I should. But if you notice, the leaves are a lot more red or purple than normal, and that's because of the light. They're getting a lot more light than they normally do growing outside in the shade. And even if you do grow them outside in the sun, when they get close to full sunlight, they will turn red or purple like this. But I'm just really pleased with how this is going. And another big surprise has been the submerged plants that are still growing. Mostly it's the Java moss that's doing so well, but you know, the pearlweed, I thinned some of the pearlweed out, and there's still some in there growing. You can see it reaching for the top. And then the pennywort is still back in there, a few sprigs here and there. And so, yeah, I'm really surprised that they're still growing at all. But I was thinking they would be more short-term until the riparian plants got big. But I'm pleased with how everything's going. Now, if you remember, the substrate that I'm using is just Fluval stratum at the very bottom, and then a layer of gravel on top. And looking back, I probably should have just mixed it all up. I'm not sure why I stratified it like that. When I do maintenance pretty soon, I think I'm going to trim some of these roots that are coming here in the front, because I have noticed as the betta is swimming around, he does kind of struggle to get around some of these roots, especially if he's between the roots and the glass. I think in hindsight, I probably would have used a branch that was more vertical than this one, but the reason I like this one was because it was going to be ideal for this particular space, and it wasn't going to block the light. The downside is the branch gets lost with all the plants growing on it now. But I think if I were to do this again, I'd probably use a branch more like this one. I don't know if you can see it all. This is just a dead azalea branch, but I think having something like that, my arm's not long enough. I think having a branch more like that's more vertically oriented would be more ideal. But this branch would also make a good piece to go as part of the background on a riparium. So I'll save that for a future project. So now it's been a few months since I set up the cherry barb tank, and I made a few changes. So if you remember, I had the hygrolite here on top, and I was dealing with have been battling algae in here, and so I decided, okay, I'm going to take this light and raise it up and use it as primarily a riparium plant light, which it's doing fantastic, and then that's going to lower the light down below in the tank itself. And I also threw in some Amazon frog bit, and a few pieces of duckweed got thrown in there too by accident. And as you can see, it's really taken off, and so it's doing its job. I wanted it to be there to take out excess nutrients, but also to provide shade and hopefully control the algae growth. Plus, I always love the roots hanging down. So I was trying to decide how to attach this light, and so I definitely wanted it at an angle, and I realized that these clamps are actually for the work lights. I decided, the angle on those clamps looks like it's ideal so that you can walk by the light and not have the light shining directly in your eyes. So I decided to take these clamps and try them as a mount. And so I just used cable ties to attach them on the lower side, and I left the upper side unattached so that I could lift it up and take a closer look at the timer and the display. And so that's working out really well. And of course, the Lucky Bamboo is going nuts. It's actually time to remove these collars. These are temporary collars that I put on these plants because at the time, the stalks were not tall enough for the bamboo to actually be resting on the substrate and all the leaves be above the tank. But now they are, and so I think I can remove these collars. I added a few sprigs of sweet potato vine, just a few cuttings that I had from outside, and I wanted to see how they would do. And of course, they're sending out roots everywhere. You can see in the very back, sending out roots everywhere. I'm trying to get them to tap into the substrate, but the problem I always run into with sweet potato is this. It's probably a nutrient deficiency, or it could be light deficiency, or both. But they always get these brown spots on the leaves. The leaves eventually desiccate. But while this is going on, it'll still be putting out new growth. So algae is still going on in this relatively new tank, but it has decreased. So I think we're going in the right direction with the lighting situation. And there's still new leaves coming out on the crypts. And the dwarf sage hasn't really been putting out new growth. I'm wondering if maybe it's not getting enough nitrogen, because I don't really have a nitrogen source in this substrate. So I may need to sneak in a few fertilizer tabs or something. I'm also wondering if part of my algae problem is from using tap water. And of course I use tap water in most of my setups, but occasionally I will get an algae problem that happens. And so far, the tanks that I've tried with using just distilled water, I haven't had the algae problem. I took several hours to acclimate these guppies to the pH. I left them in that container that was hanging here earlier, and I just slowly added more of the tank water, and then once it filled up, I took half of what was in that container out and then spent another hour or two slowly adding tank water to it. That way they could acclimate to the pH, because if you remember earlier we tested the pH in the guppy tank and it's really high. It was like off the charts, upper 7s, probably close to 8 or so. And this tank water is closer to, it's under 7. So that's a pretty drastic swing in pH, and it would be better to acclimate the fish than just put them straight into that lower pH environment. And so that's what I did, and they seem to be taking to everything pretty well. I think I have more males in here than I want, but I'll take them out at some point. I really wanted the one with the red tail, or there's two of them in there really with red tails, kind of blonde bodies. Well, that's going to be all for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to look at the rest of the tanks, and I'm going to show you a sneak peek at a project that I am working on.